No, we're recording now.
We can say what we like now, then, can we?
You can say, yeah, it'll all go down in the courtroom. So I'll just basically give you a quick run through about Portugal, but because we're quite a small group, I don't think we need to do any muting of anybody, and you could just input if you like. Has anyone been to Portugal?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, cool. Okay, whereabouts have you been?
To the north, to the Douro Valley, and to where Vino Verde comes from.
Excellent, nice.
Yeah.
Input on that.
North and down to Lisbon, or Lisbon and then up north.
Porto to Lisbon.
Yeah. And we were north of Lisbon as well.
Oh, nice. And Maddie, did you say you'd been as well?
Yeah, I've been around Porto.
Fabulous place.
Where's I can't remember where Mouchao is.
Oh, I don't know.
It's kind of central.
Don't recognise that. No.
No, but we probably wouldn't anyway.
Might be like Alentejo sort of area.
We'll go with Alan. I have been to Portugal, but I have only been to Porto and up the river a bit to the Douro. So I will, if you guys have any input to add when I'm talking about any of these other regions, then do. Portugal is a really interesting and unusual country because I've got the actual year written down. It wasn't a part of the EU until 1986, and some of you will probably remember this better than me, but I was only 5 then. So they only joined then, and previous to then, because they had dictatorship and who was it, Salazar. They were even from Spain, they were kept quite separate in many ways, and certainly cultural ways, and in terms of like the wine production, and so for that reason they have actually maintained an awful lot of their indigenous grape varieties, so what we consider to be the ones that are unique to them, and certainly the specialists of those regions, whereas a lot of other parts of Europe have sort of gone down the route of the international grape varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay. We'll plant those because we can sell those. We know there's a market, and we know we can sell those. Portugal's been a little bit protected from that, so for that reason, there's going to be a few dodgy pronunciations in this. So, does anybody here particularly good at pronouncing Portuguese?
Absolutely fluent.
We're all fluent.
I can probably pronounce it very well. It just won't sound like a Portuguese.
Yeah. There's no correct pronunciations are going to be a part of this video. I'll do my best. I have definitely heard a lot of these words more than once. It's just trying to repeat them. Becomes a bit harder. So up until this point, so the late 80s, we had quite a lot of protection, but after that point, an awful lot of the EU funding that went into Portugal went into the wineries, first of all into the vineyards. So there was some of that was modernization. So in terms of like digging up like badly planted vines and started replanting in terms of blocks of grapes, so they knew what they were actually growing, which was quite a new thing for many areas. And part of that was about, that maybe bring it slightly more in line with modern winemaking practices. So therefore losing a little bit of maybe what makes it a bit special, but certainly making the wines nicer to drink generally, as a rule. So they kind of have a little bit of the best of both worlds now, in terms of it's not just become like a modern day high street where you see the same shops all the time. It's not, it's unique and it's got its own character and it's doing great. But it does actually, it has the modern investment, it has the modern knowledge and know-how, and the equipment, and a lot of that was given to them so that they could specifically progress in that area, and now it's quite a big part of the economy. Did you get that I sent round an email with a few PDFs?
Yeah.
One of those was just like a picture from the wine economics people guys about the world's top wine producing countries. So so Portugal is this one just there. So it comes in at, I should have counted this earlier, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11th in the world. And that's from 2018. So I haven't seen more up-to-date numbers yet, but it should be somewhere similar. I know there was issues. I think a lot of Portugal was on fire and stuff in the 2019, but that often that doesn't affect the numbers as much as you might think, but like obviously it might be slightly strange. But that's quite big hitters when you think about how big Portugal is as
for the size of the country.
Exactly. And yeah, the population, that's an awful lot of wine. And part of the reason for that is domestic. People, the domestic market is strong. There is a massive culture of drinking wine. So you've all been to Portugal. I'm sure you all enjoyed the lovely, ridiculously cheap wine that's available there. It is, I think, one of the best places to get wines from in terms of value for money. Would you say the same, Maddie, in terms of value?
Yeah, definitely. Although I do find like it's still kind of catching up in terms of quality. Do you know what I mean? Like there's quite a lot of rustic practices still going on there, but like it is
good word, rustic.
better and better. So kind of the quality's catching up and the price hasn't quite caught up yet. So yeah, hitting the sweet spot now.
Yeah. We've made enough progress to warrant purchasing from there, but there are a few areas where we can still polish it out.
It's not easy to buy in France.
Oh,
It's compared to other countries' wines, Portugal seems to be the best. All the shops I've looked at, it's apart from Vino Verde, which you can find, but there's not a lot of choice. Whereas you can find much more Spanish, certainly.
There's a really, really cool supplier that we work with in Bristol at the moment called Port of Bristol, and they go around finding interesting small producers all throughout Portugal, and they bring it over by sailing ship into Bristol Harbour. So it's essentially zero carbon footprint, which it's kind of like you're drinking local because it's no carbon footprint to get there, so there's no guilt. So that's actually bringing quite a lot of Portuguese wine to Bristol at the moment, which is quite exciting.
Well, that's interesting. I'll have to come and check out your new selection once I can.
Do they also go up to Liverpool and other places on the?
Just Bristol. He's just a Bristol supplier. Yeah. It's really cool. Yeah.
That's the sort of line of work I should be in, I think. Sounds ideal. I just have to learn to sail and how to import wine. That's
speak Portuguese.
Speak Portuguese. And make loads of contacts. Other than that, I think it'll be easy. So really big player in the game, considering how big the country is, and that is just a reflection of how important wine is to them. They are historically, I think they have some of the world's oldest wine regions. The Douro is really, really old. They've been growing grapes there for millennia. It's traditionally the Douro is famous for its fortified wines, but more and more, especially with modern winemaking techniques, more and more it's becoming famous for its like normal, what we call table wines. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. I wanted to talk a bit about the structure of the wine, not the exciting wine laws in Portugal, but it is helpful again if you want to like just pick up a label and read what it says and try and work out what it means. So I think you guys, Clement Victoria, you mentioned Alentejo, didn't you?
Yeah.
Is that a DOP or DOC, did it say? Or did it say a Vinho Regional on it? Because that's one.
Vinho Regional.
Vinho Regional, excellent. So that's the region that covers the whole area. That's the one region that can be both. And Vinho Regional is essentially the same as you would get, sort of the equivalent to Vin de Pays in France.
Okay.
You have an awful lot more freedom. You can grow what you like. Does it say the grape varieties on there? That it is?
something Portuguese, but whether that's great variety is not a big idea. I'm sorry, I'd have to get a magnifying glass to read it anyway.
Oh, sure. Oh, don't worry. Anyway, I just realised after saying that some of the grape varieties to most people just look like random words. They're not exactly. Quite frequently, they're not the famous grape varieties you might have heard of. And on top of that, some different regions use the same grapes, but they call them different things. So I
like the grapes that are like somebody's name, like Juan Garcia, and
Mm.
and I think that one's got another name, which is also a person.
Mm.
It's like, okay, what do I have to do? I'll get a grape named after me. So, go down in history. Yeah, so there's loads of grapes that you wouldn't necessarily recognise as being grapes. I think I saw a figure somewhere, and obviously you see a lot of numbers bandied around about wine, but it said 250 indigenous grape varieties that are still being grown there. There may be more, there may be less in terms of commercial importance, but that's a ballpark figure for how many indigenous grape varieties that we've probably not necessarily come across too much in the UK, certainly. But you might see more and more. It's the sort of thing that if you start to be able to recognise them, and you know that you've had them in the past, that you liked it and enjoyed it, that you would start to find really good value for money, because they're not famous. You do get, especially under the Vigno Regional label as well, there's a few different ones, not just Alentejo. You do get quite a few producers now growing like Cabernet Sauvignon and more Syrah as well, which is the other name for Shiraz. But you would normally say that on the label if it is. So if you specifically want to stick to more Portuguese varieties, then just have a little look and you can check. Often they might be blended with local varieties as well. But if you want to stick to proper Portuguese, then just sort of avoid the Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah. But they do make some lovely wines there. It's just that they're not the indigenous grape. It depends what you're looking for. So yeah, there are three main different levels of wine production standards, and the top one is the DOC or DOP, depending on what language they're using. They both mean the same, and they're the same as the appellation level in France, and appellation contrôlé level, or PDO in other areas like the UK. Basically, there's 31 of those in Portugal, and they all have their own relatively strict rules compared to the Vigno Regional rules in terms of what grapes are permitted. However, compared with some regions, so you're more familiar with regions like potentially Bordeaux, Burgundy, Beaujolais, which a lot of you on the Beaujolais tasting, they have like the one grape variety or two grape varieties that they might permit, or in Bordeaux maybe 5, maybe 6. But in Portugal, even under the higher quality level, there is actually still quite a lot of leeway. So they will often tell you on the label the different grape varieties that are in it too. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, Vigno Verde drinkers, some of you, well, actually, I think you've all got quite low alcohol ones, haven't you?
I definitely have 9.5.
9.5. And Tim's with 10, I think.
Mary's disgusted. She didn't realise.
I've got the whole bottle. She's not drinking it. Yeah.
So on the Vigno Verde, this is a Vigno Verde. This is a traditional style Vigno Verde as well. So it's on the back of this, it says Vigno Verde here, and then underneath it says Moncau Melgaca. That is definitely not how you pronounce that, but this. So this is the sub-region of Vigno Verde. And this is a sort of relatively north, but not the most northern part of Vigno Verde. And this is where this style is particularly most commonly made there. And this is like the Arinto grape, the Loureiro grape, and some other like traditional grape varieties. But this is where they make these
Trajadura.
unique ones. Trajadura, yeah, absolutely.
That's the three. That's the three grapes in this one. Yeah. Arinto, Lola, and Trajadura.
Lola, yeah, that's.
Yeah. Sorry. I need the magnifying glass off Victoria when she's finished with it.
Mine says something about giving you refreshing gas.
Oh.
Victoria translated our label with the magnifying glass and decided it said made of sulfites.
Yeah, I've got some of that.
Hopefully it's not made purely of sulfites.
Hopefully.
One or two other ingredients.
Like the anti-natural wine movement.
Just one big pulp.
All sulfates.
So actually, we'll talk about now. That's a good time to talk about the natural gas, if you like, that you can get in Vineyard Verde. So that this style with this grapes that all of us just happen to have, this is the style that's most likely to have that light sparkle. So some people call it a spritz. Can you feel it when you're drinking it? You do get a very light, delicate spritz.
When it came, the first glass, which I'm still on, when it came out the bottle, was really quite like fizzy water.
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
This one, I have to say, is a bit sweet.
Oh, interesting. So yeah,
Disappointing.
that sometimes, that is not really what you would find in Portugal traditionally. I don't think.
No,
That's
no,
more
never.
an export market. Whereas more and more, I think in the UK, you're finding people are exporting the dry styles because people are coming back expecting what they've had on holiday. Whereas that's a little bit of a hangover from before people knew what Vineyard Verde was.
Okay.
I think, from what I can gather. So
I can put a couple of glasses of this one on your freezer, Tim, if you want.
No, it's all right.
You've got 3 bottles, Mum. It's
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah.
But this little spritz that it normally has, today, that's just done by adding in just like a tiny little injection of carbon dioxide. I was going to say Cabernet Sauvignon then, but we're not injecting Cabernet, so that would make a difference.
It's a tiny injection of Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah, it's really it's a very pale pink wine that you're going carbon dioxide into the gut bottle, and then so it just gives that sort of almost the same way that you would get a spritz from Coca-Cola, except much more delicate. But it used to be made by malolactic fermentation. Have we ever spoken about that before on these?
Yes.
Yes.
We have? I think.
Yeah, but remind me.
Yeah,
just
the memory's
doing
not so
quick.
good.
We're not talking about that.
I think I might have talked about it, might have spoken about it. It's something that would naturally happen to the wine after you produce a wine, well, most wine anyway. You might produce your wine, it's gone through the fermentation process, and then you put it in the barrel, and a natural conversion will then take place. So what will happen is like just bacteria and stuff in the air is, well, correct me if that's wrong, Maddie, at any point with bacteria. Well, I can understand as bacteria. It's basically going to convert the malic acid that's in the wine into lactic acid. So what that does is it creates a kind of creamy texture, a slightly dairy flavour to the wine, and it affects the acidity.
Yeah.
So it affects this acidity in a way that it softens it. And so if you're making a wine that is light and crisp, you don't want this to happen. But if you're making a wine that is rich and, red wine, they let this happen with, or like creamy Chardonnays and stuff like that. The reason it's creamy is because they let this happen. If they don't want it to happen. Oh, what's that?
And the malic acidity is the same acidity you find in apples. So like a green apple has malic acidity, and the lactic acidity is the same acid that you find in milk. So that kind of gives you a good
Yes, that is a much better way to say it. So it's like a Granny Smith's versus a cup of milk. Does that make sense?
It does.
Good. And that wouldn't actually happen, but if you use like sulfur, so might be part of the reason why it says uses sulfites on your label. If you use sulfur dioxide, you can stop that from taking place. Or if you have like really high acidity wine, then it might not happen anyway. But in the case of this, we've stopped it from happening and just added carbon dioxide to it later. Most wine, though, wouldn't be sparkling from malolactic fermentation because it would normally take place in the barrel, and then you'd bottle it later. But with this Vinho Verde, the Verde referring to it being green and young, that is because normally they would bottle it so young that the malolactic hasn't even had a chance to take place. Does that make sense? So that
it would never take place in the glass. It's got to be in wood, is it?
So if it takes place in wood, then it will be, or the gas would escape. There's a small amount of gas that is produced from this fermentation process, this conversion. Whereas if it takes place in the bottle, it will create a tiny fizz because you're not letting the gas out.
Right.
Does that
But
make
sense? So it still can happen in the bottle. Yeah.
It can, but they've stopped it from happening in this because they want to keep it fresh.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've just had word from a group that they're about to join, which is annoying because they've got Vinho Verde, so they've literally just.
Well, we'll go over it a little bit again in a bit because maybe not the whole malolactic.
That might be a bit for them anyway.
All right. Okay. It's got a light fizz because of carbon dioxide. I'll remember to keep an eye out. But so normally, historically, that would have happened in the bottle, and that would create this light fizz. But today they don't. But they did find when they added the when they started to use the modern winemaking techniques and prevent the malolactic from happening, they missed the slight fizziness that they traditionally used to have. So now that's why they just add it in. So that's why you get it. Lovely. So that's Vinho Verde. Vinho Verde is very far north. It's the northernmost region in Portugal. On your little handout thing, I sent you this little slide here. It shows you all the different DOC regions within Portugal. So there's quite a few. Some of them you hardly ever see in the UK and the UK markets, and some of them you see more frequently than others. So we won't talk about all of them. The most famous regions are the Douro, which is most famous for its pork production. Also, what other ones do we really like? The Dow, we see a reasonable amount. Alentejo, which is really, really popular and really good value for many wines. Other ones, we might see Madeira wines, again, frequently fortified. They have their own style of wine, which we can talk about in a bit if you would like to as well. Bareda, you might come across, but there's some on there, you know, I don't think I've really seen many wines from the Algarve, for example, on sale in the UK. Or the Azores. It's a long way to move.
Tasted a couple of things from Lisbon region lately that are pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and
Flores. That must be the one that you've got, Mum. Isn't that from Lisboa, or is it not?
It says it's Vinho Verde, but can you?
Oh, does it? Oh, okay, then not.
So you can only get Vinho Verde from that Vinho Verde region. I thought it was just a description of the wine rather than a.
No, it's a region.
It is a region, right?
I didn't realise that. Yeah.
In the north. But that I know that producer does produce near Lisbon as well. What was that you said, Maddie?
I was asking if you come across much Colares. It's near Lisbon on the coast, and it's like super traditional. It's all bottled in 500 ml bottles, and there's all this like old stock everywhere, like almost every producer, because they're so traditional and small, and they just don't really export much. They all have all these back vintages that are just readily available, and it's
wow.
So, yeah, I've only just come across it recently. I've got a bottle to taste at some point soon, but yeah, it's cool.
How do you spell that?
Colares.
Lovely. Yeah, I'll check that out. I love to taste to see how a wine changes over the different years.
Yeah, the sailing ship guy, he has some, so I can hook you up.
Cool. Excellent. Right, so Portugal overall has a huge range of climates, huge range of soils, and is massively influenced, in particular by one thing, which is the Atlantic Ocean. So there are some regions like Dow where it gets actually quite protected from the Atlantic Ocean, but most of the regions get really affected. Certainly parts of the regions are hugely affected by the Atlantic. In northern parts of Portugal, it's an awful lot cooler. And then also, especially in the north as well, we have got quite a lot of altitude. And on that PDF I sent out, it sort of shows you some of the bits that are a bit higher than others. It ranges from like 200 meters to about 2,000 meters, some of the different altitudes that you get. So you can imagine that makes a massive difference in terms of how we're going to ripen the grapes. There's some really traditional techniques going on still in many places. So it's one of the few areas where you might still genuinely come across winemakers who use feet to tread commercial wines. Thankfully, I think for me personally, my own personal taste, thank God it's on the down. I don't want your feet anywhere near my wines. However, it's a traditional practice, and it is still found in many places, especially in the Douro. Modern winemaking practices often have taken this out, especially in regions where they have now got a shortage of people, who to call upon to come and work at the wineries in a sort of, what am I talking about? Just
migration.
Yeah, moving around. Just seasonal workers. So here we have Aisha is here.
They're all picking carrots in Kent.
Well, yeah, exactly. We're going to witness what happens when you don't have enough seasonal workers, I think. So, but yeah, they've reacted to a lack of seasonal workers frequently by replacing foot treading with what we call robotic lagars, where they press the grapes.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry for late. Better late than never, though, I suppose.
We've been recording it, so we'll send you a link afterwards. I'll send it to Maddie, and so yeah, you can still be educated in your wine.
Yeah, and we can maybe go over the Vigna Verde bits at the end quickly, maybe. Yeah.
We have sort of touched on Vigna Verde already, but we'll go over it a little bit more in a bit. But yeah, lovely. Well. So yeah, there are two things that you might see on a label that might tell you a little bit about the quality of the wine. So we have Reserva. I did actually write down exactly what this meant. So a Reserva wine, this, you might recognize the term Reserva. You see Reserva on Spanish wines and you see it on Italian wines, but it means different things in different regions, even though it's got a legal definition, which can be a little bit confusing when you're trying to learn about wine. But in Portuguese, Reserva, if it's on the label Reserva, it means it must come from a single vintage, so just 1 year's worth of grapes. And that vintage has to be stated on the label. It must have passed a blind tasting panel. So that means that each year they'll be taking it to maintain its Reserva status, if you like. So it should be of a higher quality. It's probably going to be a bit more expensive because you have to pay for people to do these tasting panels and to put yourself in for this kind of quality level. But it gives you a little bit more peace of mind as a consumer, maybe. If it's a DOC wine, so if it's like the top quality level wine, then that means it must be a Reserva. It has to have slightly higher alcohol, maybe, than the standard. And yeah, and it should be more complex and slightly more interesting. That is Reserva. What we think maybe in terms of wine terminology, what I personally think of Reserva, I think of aging, and I think of oak aging a wine. Whereas that, the term for that on a Portuguese label is Garrafeira. Shall I? I'll write that in the notes section.
Okay, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Because it's a funny spelling. But if you click on the chat, then I'll write the word in here for you.
Have you got chat on there? Let's see it.
Yeah.
Which one says chat?
Chat.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, gotcha.
If it says that on the label, then that means it has to be aged for at least 2 years in cask, so in oak. It doesn't say it has to be new oak, so it could be old oak, but it has to be aged in oak for at least 2 years, and then another year in bottle. So
is that like Grand Reserva in Spain, is it?
That's like Reserva in Spain.
That's Reserva in Spain.
But Reserva in Portugal means something else.
Yeah.
Well, Reserva in Spain means 1 year in oak minimum, and then 3 years overall. But yeah. So yeah, it's like a combination of Reserva and Grand Reserva. That's Garrafeira. You can get whites as well under this level, and but they don't need to be aged for 2 years. They must spend at least 6 months in oak and at least 6 months in bottle. So that's good, because if a lot of whites, if you put them in oak for 2 years, they're going to become overwhelmed and maybe not particularly, fruity and fun anymore. So if they have a shorter period of time for the white wines than they do the reds. Does that make sense? Modern styles of Portuguese red wine, though, are moving kind of away from these really oaky styles. So they do still produce these really ageable, heavy, complex reds, but an awful lot more producers are moving away from oak aging or moving into a shorter period of time in oak, and producing wines that are able to be drunk younger. The youngest style to be drunk are the Vinho Verde wines that are red. So we don't normally see those in the UK market very much, but nearly a half of the production of the Vinho Verde region is really youthful red wine. So they just drink a lot of it in Portugal. Don't see it as that. And again, it's called Vinho Verde not because of the colour, but because the Verde refers to the greenness of it in terms of its youthfulness. So it's really young wine, bottled really young to be drunk really youthfully. Drunk youthfully.
Have a similar character to the Vinho Verde white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, what was that? Sorry.
Does it have a very similar character to the white Vinho Verde? Or have I missed that?
It's like, it's got sort of red fruit characteristic. It's lighter. It's unoaked style. It's sort of an easy drinking. So it's a similar, I guess, closer in style to what you might think of a sort of a youthful Beaujolais, or maybe a very young, light French red from northern France, maybe, or somewhere. But
it's made me think of years ago we were served some red Lambrusco, which we nearly fainted at, but actually it was delightful.
Ah, nice. Well, that often would be a bit sparkling. But yeah, that sort of lighter, fruity style. Lambrusco, it's got a really bad name in the UK, but it's actually really nice high quality.
Fabulous.
What was that, Maddie?
You can get such good Lambrusco though. It can be really, really interesting.
You just need the right supply, do you?
Yeah, I don't actually think I've ever come across a red Vinho Verde.
I've never seen. No, I don't think I have. I've not been to that part of Portugal.
We bought some when we were in Portugal. It was a local one, but in fact it was pretty horrible. We didn't like it at all. It was just one that they were just doing from a local sort of barrel sort of thing. But I mean, that doesn't mean to say they're all like that. But that particular one we tried, we just didn't enjoy it at all. But,
I feel like there must be a reason the UK market largely doesn't bother with it.
Yeah, that sort of wine doesn't travel well, does it? I don't.
Yeah.
Well, this one didn't travel to Portugal.
Well, I think if it's really light red, it probably doesn't.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
It's not. If you're in a hot country, you want to drink light red, but you don't want to try and store it anywhere. It'd be quite difficult to keep it fresh. Yeah. What else was I going to try and tell you then? Okay, I've lost that bit of notes. Oh, here we go. Oh yeah, another thing you might see on a number of labels is the term quinta or quinta. So again, I'll write that here. You might come across that quite frequently on wines from Douro, especially, and they talk about sort of single estate wines, but essentially it translates as farm or estate, and it's the same type of way that you would use chateau in Bordeaux or something you talk about. So you see this term come up often. It means that the wines will come from one single estate then, but it doesn't mean anything in particular about the quality of that wine other than that. There is another terminology some more terminology I found for farm. But now I've just realised I don't know where I wrote that down. So I'll find that in a bit and hopefully tell you. But further down south, there is other terminology that you might use. But officially, quinta is what we would think of as chateau. Cool. Yeah. Any questions about any of that so far?
No, it's really good.
Good. I might tell you about the regions a little bit then in that case. So we have talked about Vinho Verde a little bit. So for you guys that just came, Vinho Verde, it is normally we would think of it as this quite light alcohol, quite thin wine that's quite refreshing and slightly spritzy. Is that what you have got there?
Yeah.
Is it quite low in alcohol?
Zayn and Aisha.
Are they?
Yeah. We're on mute.
No, I'm unmuted right now.
Hello.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, we've only had a couple of sips. Sorry, we've got my boyfriend's dog here at the moment. She's whining a lot.
Oh. In which
case,
case, thank you very much for telling me.
Does it taste quite light?
Yeah,
I think so.
my boyfriend tried it and he said that he really likes it. So
It is a really nice one, that one. Yeah. I would say that has a bit more concentration to it than some. It's got a fair bit of fruit to it, but it's still light and refreshing, tiny bit of a spritz.
Nice. That is normally we would expect that style to come from the Moncao region or the Melgaco region, which is definitely not pronounced correctly, or Lima or Cavado. So these are sub-regions. This is sort of central to the Vinho Verde region. Further north than that, though, is another sub-region where they specifically grow from, I find the name of the sub-region, from Melago to Valle de Cambra. They grow an awful lot of Alvarinho. Have you come across Alvarinho grape variety before? Becoming more and more popular, especially from northern parts of Spain, and in particular the bit just north of Portugal, where it's spelt slightly differently without the H. So it's Albarino, and it's not got a V in it. Instead, it's got a B. But Alvarinho, if you see that, that's the same grape as Albarino. And that can also be a Vinho Verde, but that will be just made from the one single grape. So if it says Vinho Verde Albarino, that will be a very different style to the style that you've got the guys that are drinking, and myself drinking Vinho Verde from further south. So it's
those guys, theirs is Lorero.
Yes.
Is the grape, yeah.
Lorero means, it translates as bay or laurel, so it should have a slightly sort of more mineral herbaceous kind of character to it, especially if it's 100% that one. This one has that in the blend as well, and it has a bit of more of a kind of mineral quality. Yeah, it's quite nice. It's called the laurel grape. I like that. But the Albarino is it was the very first grape in Portugal to be bottled on its own. So that tells you everything you need to know about the history of blends in Portuguese winemaking, that even the white wines almost entirely blends for millennia. For many, many years, they wouldn't really be 100% sure what was in their vineyards, and there'd be several different varieties of grapes grown within one block of vines, which was an absolute pain in the ass if you're trying to prune a vine, if you're trying to treat a vine, and like as specifically as you would for that type of grape variety. Different things need to happen at different times of the year. Different grapes need different amounts of sunlight. Different grapes, if you're irrigating the vines, they're going to need different amounts of water. All these different things have different effects. So it's historically almost all the vineyards were planted loads of different types of different vines. But since the EU funding and since the basically they grubbed up a load of vines and replanted them in blocks so they knew what was where, and they are now able to make some wines that are just one single grape variety, but it's still quite rare. Albarino is the most likely one that you will find of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. So that's Vinha Verde. I think it's the biggest DOC in Portugal. It's quite important to the stars of wine produced in Portugal, and it is so very famous. They do, I mean, the red grapes they grow there, I could tell you a few of them, like we have Avelrau, Amaral, Boracal, Espadero, Padero, that they're not grapes that you come across normally. They're very much specifically indigenous to that area of Portugal and very much suitable to these very light styles of red. I would say that also just as famous, if not potentially more famous, but more so for the fortified wines, is the Douro region. So I'll just talk about that a little bit as well. This area, this is where you're most likely to find your people doing the grape treading with their bare feet. Get out of my wine with their bare feet. They frequently grow the grapes here on very steep slopes, and these can be quite famous. You might have come across, has anybody been to the vineyards in Douro? Or?
Get to the vineyards. There are very steep slopes in the valley, isn't it?
Yes, yes, those terraces. It makes like grape growing really difficult and awkward and quite expensive to do because you've got to maintain these terraces, and they're all kept up. The earth is kept in place by these dry stone walls that people then have to maintain. You can't use a machine on these vineyards because there's no tractor that will drive up onto these slopes. Even the ones that are slightly less steep, you can only use like very minimal amounts of machinery there. There's not, you're not sending normal harvesters down them or anything like that. So it can be quite high quality grape growing, but a little bit more expensive to do, but still great value for money. Each year, I mean, we won't talk too much about port because that's a separate tasting, but each year they decide how much port they're going to produce based on what the sales have been like in previous years and what the stocks are like of past vintages, and because they don't want to just flood the market full of port. So on that basis, they'll decide how much port they're going to produce that year, and then the rest of the grapes are going to go into the red wine production. And now more and more white wine is being made here as well, and normal dry white table wines. Really nice, high quality dry whites are coming from that area as well. Again, traditional local varieties, and could also go into white port. But because a lot of the vineyards may go into port and they may go into table wine, a lot of the grapes are the same. So we have you heard of Touriga Nacional? That's the big one in the Douro. This is really high quality ageable reds and really big for port production. And Tinto Rariz, which you may not have heard of as that, but it's the other name for Tempranillo that they have here.
Oh.
So that's the Rioja grape, and big in Portugal, Spain, massive in Spain, grape. So that's two of the major ones that they have here. And again, so you've got your ageable, high quality red wine production going on. Lovely, lovely, delicious wines being made. Some vineyards are just to make red wine, but there is an awful lot of overlap between some vineyards which will have some of the grapes growing towards port and some that go towards standard wines. Yes. Divided into 3 sections: the Baxacorgo, Simacorgo, and the Douro Superior. It might tell you on the label where it's coming from. It might be a blend of the 3 different areas, but by far the most likely area is the Simacorgo. It's got some great wines coming from that area, but it's also quite prolific as well. Produces an awful lot of wine. And then, yeah. Any questions about the Douro whilst we're on it?
No.
Do you know where I mean? The river, the Douro. It comes across. It is the Duero as it comes through Spain. So you get like Ribeira del Duero is the banks of the Duero, and then it comes into Portugal and becomes the Douro, and then all the vineyards along the valley of that river take the name of it. There is another river.
When you were talking about superior and so on, was that talking about the high how the land is, or how good the wine is?
That's the land. So they're talking about the region.
Yeah, right. So, yeah.
Another river that is important is the Tagus. Might not be pronouncing that properly, don't know. But Tagus. And this gives its name to a few of the other wine regions. So Alentejo, the Tejo, is referring to this Tagus River. So Alentejo means beyond the Tagus. So I'm assuming that means from the north, everything that goes beyond the Tagus, because it covers an awful lot of the south of Portugal. It's a huge expanse of area. If you take in the Vinho Regional area. It's enormous. There's only about 5% of the land is planted with vines, but they still produce a large amount because it's so popular. And they make these very nice, soft, easy drinking reds. They're really good value for money. Don't need to be aged for a long time before you drink them, but you can age them if you want to for a bit, and they might change. They might develop a bit in the bottle. And yeah, when it comes to the style of wine, especially in countries like the UK, it's exactly the style of wine that we like to drink. So very, very popular. Can get a little bit of some of the other regions winemakers can get a little bit haughty about it because they don't. It's like a Frenchman talking about Spanish wine. They're just a bit jealous because it's easy for them to make, really easy to drink nice and enjoyable wines for cheaper. Within the Alentejo, though, there are DOC, so that top level of the quality bracket of wine. There are DOC wines, DOC Alentejo, and the difference it will say on the label, whereas this says Vinho Verde DOC, that would say Alentejo DOC instead. And if it's not the DOC level, then it will say Alentejo Vinho Regional. And often it might say another name as well, which is a sub-region category. So you can find both. The Alentejo DOC is a bit more precise and only has certain grape varieties permitted, whereas Vinho Regional has a little bit more leeway. Yeah. Apparently the nicest time to go and visit is April or May. So hopefully by this time next year, we'll be able to go on holiday to Portugal. I mean, I was reading about this earlier and I was like, oh, imagine really feeling the need to go away.
We did Lisbon in May last year for a child-free 4-day long weekend. It was, yeah, I'd highly recommend it.
I'm going to be coming to you to get recommendations, definitely. Sounds absolutely wonderful. Yeah, from the Vinho Regional, this is where you're most likely to find your Syrah or Shiraz grape being grown as well. So if you want something that is a little bit more familiar and really good value for money, then that could be a good one to go for. Oh, here we go. This is so another in the Alentejo. Instead of seeing the word quinta for the estate or farm, you might see the word monte. Monte, and again that just refers to farmhouse or estate. So if you see that, that's what that means. You do get that on some South American wines as well. Our main grapes there, which I'll say for the DOC wines, again, if you haven't heard of them, don't worry. We have like Aragonés, some people may have heard of, but maybe not. Trincadeira, Castellao, Afroquiero, and Alicante Boucher. Now you've heard of them, even if you haven't.
Alicante Boucher, fun fact.
Pardon?
Alicante Boucher, fun fact.
Oh.
The flesh and the juice. The flesh is actually red.
Yes, that's it. I knew I'd read about it.
It's one of the only ones.
So if you actually squish the grapes, the juice would come out pink, which is really unusual for grape juice. And there's a term for that, isn't there? I can't remember what it.
Yeah, I can't remember either. It's probably a French word, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. They probably have a different word in Portugal anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those so you might hear about it for that reason as well. And then the other region I wanted to tell you about just quickly is DAO, which is DAO, which you can historically find some pretty robust wines from this region. But I really like wines from this region to try them myself, because you find often you get more modern, sort of more perfumed, more delicate and aromatic styles of red coming from here. I think I have had some nice whites from there as well, but I haven't had them recently enough to think to describe them. But we have grapes such as Jaen, which I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but Jaen, which can be used to make these lovely, like, more floral styles of red. And I really recommend, if you do come across those, just giving them a try as well. If you like lighter, fresher, fruitier reds, but not so fruity that you're in your kind of Vino Verde sort of territory. Yeah. Has anybody got any questions about those?
Good recommendation.
Yeah. You might. The trouble is, I suppose, if you're in France and you're struggling to come across anything other than Vino Verde, you might not find a DAO wine very easily. Next time you're on the ferry and you're going past Majestic or something, they might have one in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So is everybody in France?
A lot of these guys, yeah.
Quite a few of us.
Otherwise, we would have sent them to your shop, of course, to get them.
Yeah, okay. So my Bristol supplier recommendation, not very relevant. I don't know if he stops by France on his way to the UK. But
well, we'll be there in a few weeks.
Yes.
Well, yeah, sure.
Hopefully,
yeah.
Fingers crossed. But yeah, is there anything that we haven't covered at all that people were wanting to ask about?
No, right.
Yeah.
I have a question that's not related to Portuguese wine, but it's
yeah, that's fine.
something that's intrigued me for a long time. Years ago, I read a report somewhere that a bunch of sommeliers had got together and done blind testing of wines that had been opened and allowed to breathe, and others that had not been allowed to breathe, and they couldn't tell the difference. What's your view? I'm a Philistine. I can't tell the difference.
So there is actually a science behind it now. So it's not, whereas there are different things that will come into play. So the temperature, the room, even they've discovered things like the music that's playing. All these things are going to have an effect on how much you can detect different wines, and how just all these mad, different, crazy things that will have an effect on your psychology, which has such a powerful effect on the way you taste.
Yeah.
So things like pressure, for example, then will affect that too. But you can look at the way that different compounds become volatile when they are exposed to air.
Yeah.
And the air does make a difference. And there are plenty of different other people who say, they've tasted it in their own home, one that's been this, and there's always the one that's reported in the press is the one that proves that all wine tasting is fraud. And it doesn't matter how many thousand times the tasting's been done and it's proven to not be. It's the same as you always hear, like, and the British beat the French at making champagne once in like one of the many tastings 20 years ago, and the French have won how many times, and it's definitely not in the press. It's a little bit, it's one of those things. where you kind of have to sort of take it with a pinch of salt. But some people believe this and some people don't, but I think there's certain days of the week you're going to taste it differently. Everything, I think, affects how you taste it. I can taste something an hour later and it might taste the same, or it might have completely changed.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion, Maddie, on that?
Yeah, well, I think it depends like how long you're going to give it to breathe. Because if you think about the actual area that's exposed to air when you open the bottle, it's very small. You've got all the liquid in the bottle, and then this is the air. So if it's open for a couple of days, I think it definitely does make a difference and soften it. But if you're about to drink it and you in an hour, and it's like a really young red wine that's really tannic, then decanting it, that exposes it to a lot of air really quickly. So as the wine's pouring into the decanter, it's exposed to air and all the flavors open up. And
that I can understand.
Yeah, that would definitely have a much bigger effect.
My sense of taste isn't that good, but I know that James, our son, he has one of these things where you can pour the wine through one of these little funnels and it bubbles air into it.
Yeah.
And I can certainly tell the difference then when you've just poured it through this thing or when you've not poured it. In fact, I don't like it as much. I prefer it unpoured through there. But there is definitely, normally, if you ask me to tell the difference, I'm the wrong person completely, but I could tell the difference on that one.
I had a winemaker, I loved the way he described it once, that like, he said wine is like, when it's in the bottle, he says it's like a small child locked in a small room. He said it's just going like this and it just like wants to get out and move around and jump around, and then as soon as it kind of hits the air and goes into the glass, and it's happy. And,
like me with wine. It's mirroring what I'm doing as soon as it goes in the glass. Does that answer your question, Clive?
Really, absolutely, yes. Thank you. Yes.
My recommendation is to get Victoria to try it for you, like so that you taste it blind and see which one you prefer.
Another thing I'd recommend, Clive.
Yes.
The other thing I'd recommend, Clive, is do you ever go to the Cheval Blanc?
Yeah.
Occasionally, yes.
Have you ever had one of their more expensive wines when they put it through their special decanter?
No.
Well, we went once. Somebody else was paying for the wine, but it was 70 or 80 euros a bottle. And we tasted it before it went in the decanter, and then we tasted it after. And there was just no comparison. One was like drinking something particularly, not very pleasant, and the other thing was like drinking nectar. It was quite extraordinary. It was extraordinarily different.
That's often to do with especially that style of wine where it has a lot of opening up to do.
Yeah.
The biggest difference. You can for a mere £17,000, you can buy your own one of those machines.
Only 17,000.
Okay.
Well, the amount we drink at Les Allades, that would probably be not that bad.
Probably 10 cents a bottle.
You just get a communal one. Collaborate.
Yeah.
Yes.
oh no, sorry.
I thought you wanted to say something.
I just dropped my phone on the floor and it nearly hit the wine glass, and so.
Never mind the phone.
Yeah, if it's Vino Verde, the only wine that's all right to spill on the floor, because it might not make any.
Yeah, it might actually take the stains away.
Yeah, probably.
Sorry, a final question from me. Should we ever buy Mathieu's Rosé ever again then?
Oh, well, if you enjoy drinking it, then yeah, Maddie's saying no.
Does that come from one region?
I think it does. Oh, there you go. Like, what does it say on it, Tim? Has it got a region on there? Or?
It says the original.
Oh! I can't see an original region on this map.
Established in 1942. It doesn't say anything well, it's actually mostly written in Portuguese, so I haven't a clue what it says.
Okay.
No, I suspect I'll keep it for some occasion when somebody's coming that I don't like.
Watch out for
Yeah,
that,
watch it, Tim.
Oh, bugger.
Yes, now I've let
Save it for Matthew. Yeah.
It probably comes.
I think it's not as bad as you might imagine, but it's not going to be great.
It probably comes from Belarus these days.
Yeah.
I'm suspicious of the. I like very pale rosés, and that's got a bit too much colour for my liking.
Yeah.
It's quite sweet as well, isn't it? I can't remember the last time I've tasted it, but
I fear it is. I suspect it's not going to be for a long time, if ever.
I think it's not sweet if you compare it to like the Californian ones, but it is if you compare.
Oh,
if you used to drink it really pale.
Oh, the California.
Yeah.
you could make sangria with it.
Yes.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Or
Probably clean toilets with it.
yeah,
It was
donated
Jimi
to
Hendrix's
fries.
favourite wine.
Jimi Hendrix's favourite wine, yeah.
So look, here you go. Here's a
What's
recipe
it?
for Matthias Frosé.
Oh, perfect.
Wild berry fruit juice, vodka, sugar, strawberries, and ice in it. There you go.
Oh,
That's well, it's got to be good with that in it.
Yeah.
It's quite good, doesn't it?
Matthew Frosé.
Matthias Frosé, yeah, we'll try that.
Drink it and it improves your guitar playing anyway.
Does anybody else have any questions?
No, so.
no, we're good.
How long would Matthias, the Vino Verde keep?
Not long. I mean, yeah, the idea, the green refers to that youthfulness, and the idea is that you should try and drink it. It's definitely not going to be getting any better. If you did find one that said Vino Verde Alvarinho on it, that is this different style to that, then that's more like a slightly more ageable wine. You could keep that for a couple of years, no problem. But normal standard Vino Verde made from those grapes that we talked about, the Trincadeira, the Lure, and all those ones, then that is just drink it, do not store it.
This one's got a year on it. It says Grande Escola 2015.
Oh my God.
Well, yeah,
That's more than a year ago.
So that's 5 years old already, and maybe that's why.
And did you say it was sweet as well?
Yeah.
That is an unusual bottle of wine you've got. What does it?
Well, it came from Noz for €2.39.
I mean, crispy. Sometimes what they do in normal, like sort of cheap wine production, is store the wine after it's been made in quite massive chilled stainless steel containers, so it doesn't actually. It sort of holds it in stasis a bit, so they don't then bottle it until much later. But because it's stainless steel and chilled, it shouldn't be maturing, and it won't be taking on any oaky flavors and stuff. So it could potentially, but Vino Verde, the whole point of Vino Verde is to bottle it when it's young. So
I know. I mean, I'd forgotten that I'd got it in the wine rack. I must have bought it a couple of years ago.
Oh wow! Okay, yeah. So
I mean, it tastes. It's perfectly drinkable, but it's just a bit sweeter than the ones that I'm used to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I want to know what it tastes like.
I mean, even
this might be keeping it fresher as well.
Yeah. Even this one that we got from Liz and Tony, it was 2017 from Majestic, and it's perfectly fine. But that is just typical Liz, having bottles and bottles of wine that she hasn't drunk when she should have drunk them younger, I think.
Mine's 2018, so that's about as old as you want it to be, I think.
Yeah.
I think this one.
This is fine.
What's yours, Dana? Is it 18? I think.
It's 18 as well. Just
Yeah.
That seems to be the standard. What's on the market at the moment? I think 2018. Yeah, don't lie it down.
No.
No, drink that.
But it just goes to show that you could. It's still drinkable, even though
definitely.
it's old. It's
Well,
just
this one is
not as it should be.
Yeah, it's fine.
I reckon with the bottle age and the sweetness, you could like compare it to the Matthias Rosé quite well. The color, they might be quite similar.
Could well be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another reason for leaving the Matthias Rosé in the bottle.
Nice. Oh, cool.
Excellent.
Oh, good. So, any other questions? How about you guys that came in later? Is there anything you'd like to ask?
No, it's been very informative for someone who knows nothing about
Yeah,
wine.
I know nothing. Everything that was said was new.
Yes, you do, Zaina. I've taught you things.
I'm not to say I do know stuff. Maddie has.
People always say they know nothing about wine, and then you start talking to them, and they actually do know lots about wine.
Everything I know is from Maddie, to be fair.
Oh, well, she knows a lot about wine, so that's a good source. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
Excellent.
Well, excellent.
Right.
Okay.
Nice one.
Look
Well,
forward to the port one, but not tomorrow.
okay. Yes, we'll do that another day.
Another day.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot,
Cheers.
Ruthie.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Drew. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye then. Oh.